why don't we get started? People are going to probably join as we go through this. So I'm so excited to introduce Kelly Shortridge to the New York Information Security Meetup slash the Cyber Guild. Um, you know, uh, I think Kelly, I think you are probably the most prolific security professional that I've had on these podcast. Your contribution to this space is truly is amazing, and also I've noticed the phenomenal progression because I've watched videos from past years, and you're getting better and better and better in terms of presenting and in terms of generating content. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat today. We're basically going to try to cover as many topics as we can in the next 35, 40, 45 minutes at the most. And hopefully people get a glimpse of you, what you've done, and just your thoughts on the cybersecurity space. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And that was enormously flattering. So thank you. I know you've had some pretty cool speakers in the past, so appreciate it.
Yeah, and you know what? I also noticed and I've tried it in my physical events in New York City prior to COVID to have a balanced male female, and it's just the cybersecurity space is it's hard to women are not the majority, so I try to balance it out. So I appreciate you coming as well. So why don't we get started, and maybe how did you get into the space? Maybe start from the beginning. How do you started, and maybe kind of all the way to your current role today.
It's an incredibly circuitous path. So I started out in investment banking, doing mergers and acquisitions, what's known as M&A, covering information security companies as well as data analytics companies, and did a little bit of capital raising as well. But part of that was my job was to get up to speed on the industry, understanding the main problems, what were the unaddressed kind of like gaps in the space. Because obviously if you're like large company looking to acquire some sort of smaller company, you're looking to go into high growth areas. So my job was to understand all of those, and I ended up kind of falling in love with the technology side, which led me to double down and actually leave finance and start my own startup, which was doing mobile monitoring and access control. That was later acquired by one of the larger security companies. And during that process, I realized I still really loved understanding the problems that users, customers were facing in the industry, which led me kind of to this product track, building security products and trying to do so in a way that actually helps people and is not just a bunch of snake oil. So I've now worked at BAE Applied Intelligence, then Security Scorecard, and now I'm at Capsule8.
And your background, your academic background, is actually economics.
Yes.
Right. Because in a lot of people are interested in, so the Cyber Guild is promoting people to get into the cybersecurity space and maybe move from different areas. And I viewed a video of how you present all the different options within the space, and so investment banking to your own startup. What kind of skill sets are required for somebody in this space? And then also, what helped you along the way? Like, what was kind of the turning point? And how does someone who does investment banking decide to create a security product?
It's a good question. I think the ultimate thing is curiosity, which sounds like a wishy-washy answer. I think there's also a huge difference between the skills people should be learning in order to enter the industry and the ones that are currently required for jobs. I would argue that people need to think critically, be able to communicate technical concepts in a way that is digestible for people who aren't familiar with those concepts, and also be able to understand things like user empathy, things like UX. But that's not stuff you really see very often in job kind of like specs when you're starting out in the industry. It's really like most of the time what people expect is like the OWASP top 10, understanding kind of like basic threat models, being able to talk about other sort of like basic security concepts. But I would argue that what we're lacking in the industry right now is that ability to look at a problem, not just accept the kind of like high level answer, like really dig deeper, like what are the underlying factors, and ensure that you do so in like a blameless way, like no pointing fingers at, like stupid users. yeah, making sure that then we can communicate whatever kind of like resulting outcome or output is, because I think a huge problem in InfoSec is kind of a PR problem, both internally in organizations as well as externally. I think people think that InfoSec is this arcane art, and I can tell you, coming from investment banking, where I had like no computer science background to where I am now, it's actually not that hard. The industry likes to present itself as really difficult, which I kind of think is a self-defense mechanism or a little ego stroking. But it really isn't that hard. So being able to communicate these concepts in a way that more people can understand, especially when you're talking to like development teams, when you're talking to like a board of directors, if you're a CISO, that's the type of stuff that we're missing in the industry. So I'd encourage anyone who does have good communication skills, has like a rigorous kind of track record in critical thinking, like shout out to all the liberal arts majors, definitely entertain InfoSec as a potential career path.
Yeah, and you had a kind of a warning saying, "Hey, the industry is pessimistic, and this, so." But you seem to really enjoy it, and you're very passionate about particular areas, and it also looks like you're trying to address, kind of the elephant in the room sometimes, right?
Yes.
Things that are not, well, everybody thinks it, but not everyone is willing to go out and say it. Like for example. In some of the RSA talk that you gave, you talked about the issues with, FUD in the industry, the disconnect between products and personas, a misunderstanding of personas, and promotion of security as a blocker instead of an enabler. So aside from obviously promoting this in the industry, how do you approach that on a day-to-day basis as part of being a product manager now for yet another startup?
Yeah, product management is huge about user empathy in general, and really you can't accept kind of the BS answers, which I feel like a lot of InfoSec does. A lot of InfoSec, I feel like it's just looking at the kind of like first order problem without digging deeper, which is a huge issue. If you want to be a good product manager, you can't do that. You have to understand like, okay, what are the true underlying factors that are contributing to these problems that our users are experiencing. So that's definitely relevant. And for Capsule8 specifically, I'm trying to do a lot of work in making security concepts more approachable from kind of an evangelism standpoint to developers and people working in operations. Because I truly think if you are building and maintaining systems, you should be part of securing systems. And it really isn't as scary as you might think. So that's a lot of the external facing kind of work I do. And my current company is around that, like how to make security more approachable to those communities.
So it's really interesting. So you are approaching it from the product management perspective, but the talks you give, you also talk about the different areas within the industry, and in particular, you mentioned. And one of the quotes we put up, it was which I really loved, is the Alexander Pope, right? To err is as human, to forgive divine. And you talk about how within secure system we must work with nature rather than against it. And so what do you mean by that? And this is like unbelievable, because it's you're right. Every time I look at a presentation from the security side of the house, vendors and so on, they almost say, hey, there's no way you should do this. Like this is you can't make mistakes, but we're trying to make that change. So, what do you suggest? How do we solve that?
I think there's a long way to go before we can totally solve it. But the key thing is making sure that we understand that we can't just force humans to do what we want. I feel like we can barely force computers to do what we want half the time. So it's a little strange to me that in InfoSec, a lot of what you see is like, oh, well, we created the policy and then humans violated the policy. Clearly the humans are at fault. It's like, okay, but why did they violate the policy? Do you really think it's because they're stupid or lazy, or is it because they need to get their job done? They need to sell things, they need to deploy things. Like, why aren't you digging deeper? So I think that's a big chunk of how we're going to solve it, is by getting people in security to start. Again, it's kind of not accepting that first answer, which is like laziness or stupidity or ignorance or whatever else. It's really thinking about, okay, what are the true factors underlying these issues? I think you see it everywhere, though, whether it's policies like I mentioned, you see stuff like, oh, if users just hadn't clicked the link, then everything would be fine. Also, as I've said before, like if your organization falls apart because a user clicks a link, that's your fault as the security team. Like this is what, 20 years of users doing that now. If that's not baked into your threat model, like you're doing something terribly wrong. And I think where you're really starting to see it and where I think tensions are coming to a head is in that kind of like DevOps and security relationship, because security is trying to go with their old methods of just forcing the humans to do what they want. And DevOps is kind of like, okay, that's cool, except we're the ones who are making money for the business and you're slowing us down. So we're actually not going to do any of what you're telling us to do. So security, frankly, is just going to have to adjust to understand like what are the actual workflows people are conducting. How do we fit into those in a way that still obviously promotes like more secure software delivery, but isn't totally disrupting the way the business is making money? Part of the problem is security people often just don't understand how software delivery works. A lot of times they understand kind of their little corner of InfoSec, but they don't understand anything about the workflows that they're trying to secure. That's a huge problem. So I think those are just like two elements of how we're eventually going to solve this problem. But I think it's somewhat realistic that the DevOps side, I've now spoken at a few conferences just targeted to those people, and I have friends in that space. They pick up on security stuff a lot quicker than security people pick up on DevOps stuff. So if I had to guess, they'll be able to start just circumventing the security teams, which we don't want, right? So I think security people don't start considering more how to work with nature, how to work with the way the business is actually operating, they might find themselves a little obsolete down the line.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, is it possible, do you think, to fix technology with technology, or any particular, technologies out there that you're very excited about and potentially think that this is going to be a game changer? Because again, there are, thousands of vendors out there, right? As we know. Yeah. Okay. So what are your thoughts about it? Next, few years, what do you see is going to be emerging as part of these vendors? Are you going to be seeing consolidation? Are there certain technologies we're going to pick up? Because we keep hearing these, buzzwords: AI, machine learning, all kinds of, now even quantum computing. There's no lack of it. I think you had a research that you've done that particularly you counted, the kind of the FUD words in different websites, which I thought was
buzzword bingo. Yep. I've done that a few years now. It's kind of depressing, but I tried to make the depression into a game. So anyone on there, check it out if you want kind of a masochistic game. I think we're still going to see a proliferation of, frankly, just super snake oil security startups. There's still a ton of VC funding, even with kind of like a COVID slowdown. You're seeing more funding kind of the later stages. So companies that already have some sort of market stake are still getting more funding, even if they're struggling. It's more companies that are just starting brand new are struggling to find funding. But I think we'll see a lot more. We're just going to see more of the same. Like it goes in cycles, right? Like it's not like anomaly detection is a new thing as far as hype, but now people are just calling their if statements deep learning now. That's the main difference. I think all of that is going to pale in comparison to the security benefits we get from a lot of just infrastructure technology. Talked about this at length in other places. But even thinking about things like serverless functions, obviously not useful for everything, but they're ephemeral, they're immutable. Like your threat model changes vastly. Like it simplifies a lot of what you have to worry about from a security perspective. That is not a security tool. It is not some like Blinky box or Blinky SaaS or whatever you want to call it now. It's something that is supposed to be kind of like a performance and scale optimization that happens to have these security benefits. And I think where we're going to see the most security potential is out of those tools. It's not out of, whatever incremental improvement we see from security vendors. It's certainly not going to be from what I call all the vendors that are actually features masquerading as products, where they really are just like a very small slice of solving the problem set. But I think we'll still see more of those. Again, security is a hot space. I think the amount it's discussed as a potential risk to the business is way overinflated relative to its actual risk to most businesses. But it means that it's going to attract lots of funding and a lot of snake oil salespeople in the industry. So I don't expect us to see fewer startups, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you talk about specifically a product, right? So you mentioned that we need to treat security as a product. So what do you mean by that? And I saw a couple of presentations that you specifically mentioned that we don't do that well enough.
Yeah, I think the most succinct way to put it is right now, InfoSec just isn't really accountable for tangible outcomes. If you talk to a lot of security programs, they really struggle with what metrics to show. They don't know how to demonstrate success. They put money into a program. They aren't necessarily able to articulate how it's actually benefited the business, outside of kind of like finger to the wind and very rough estimates. And I think when you treat things as a product, you can't really have that outside of some of the kind of moonshot products at Google, maybe. But when you have a product, you have a customer base, you have a user base. Right now, InfoSec doesn't really think about having users, but it does. Its organization is its customer ultimately. When it's trying to secure, again, like software delivery, that means that the development teams are actually their user base. And once you start thinking in those terms, you have to care about workflows. You have to care about what are the competing kind of goals and priorities of our users, and how can we best solve these problems. The problem is, right now, InfoSec thinks of itself kind of as this, I call like abstract and moral like mission, like, oh, it's our duty to like make everything secure. That's just not what organizations need. The moral argument, I feel like that could be its own conversation, but pragmatically, like you have to think about what is the actual benefit to the business? What are the assets that matter most to the business? Some stuff just isn't going to matter. And you have to think about it more from like, how are we actually solving these user problems? And what are our KPIs and success metrics? You just don't really see that today in InfoSec.
And it's really interesting. So you are, as a product owner right now, how do you map the product to the end user, to the business unit? Say, it's all about enabling business, right, as opposed to being an inhibitor. So in your day-to-day job, like how do you reach out those users? Sometimes the users are almost unknown. You don't have a chance to actually interact with them on a regular basis, and sometimes you do that through sales, which is almost like not the buffer you want. So how do you overcome that and find out what the business does, and how to enable the mapping between the product and the business units?
Yeah, so for building a security product specifically, we definitely talk to our actual user base, like our actual customers. A lot of them are more than willing to talk in order to make the product better. That is the benefit of working at a startup versus a giant company. Frankly, like a lot of what I do is just talk to people in my network as well. People who aren't necessarily our customers or users, but it's part of building that empathy and understanding like, what are their goals right now? What are their current concerns? What are kind of like the conflicts or major like stresses they have at the moment? Because that helps inform kind of like looking ahead to the roadmap, how we can better serve just like the general market. I think one thing, going back to kind of something I keep bringing up in this conversation, is I'm always considering the operations persona as part of kind of understanding our users, because the operations persona is increasingly part of any buying decision for security, particularly anything that's going to be deployed into production environments. Security people aren't the ones deploying tools into production. Operations will mostly like slap their hand and be like, don't touch it. We don't want you to bork anything, right? So we have to inherently think about like, okay, how can we kind of preempt any objections that operations teams are going to have? What kind of like carrots can we provide to these operations teams to make them more likely to want to facilitate deployment and support the purchase of the tool?
Mm-hmm. So what does Capsule8 do? Maybe, I don't know, you mentioned you're responsible for product there. Maybe you can give us a quick idea of what it do, and how you evolve to, what does your day-to-day actually look like? Because I think a lot of it is kind of, vague for people that are not familiar with product management.
Oh yeah, so there is no true day-to-day. So super briefly, Capsule8 does enterprise Linux protection. So basically, bare metal containers, VMs, clouds, whatever you want. If it runs Linux, then we're making sure that unwanted behavior is obviously alerted upon or blocked, if you prefer. So my day-to-day really depends. I think there is no consistent one, which is maybe true for a lot of people's jobs in general. So I straddle between figuring out how we talk about a product externally in the market, what kind of community education we can do. So recently, I published a blog post about a vulnerability in Grub2, trying to make it like really digestible, even for people who aren't security experts or who aren't familiar with like bootloaders. Then internally, I also try to figure out, okay, how should we prioritize the roadmap? If there are any like concerns or risks or other considerations we have coming up, like how do we figure out how to like tweak that roadmap, figuring out just general feature prioritization, stuff like that. The unifying theme is really understanding the market problems, understanding what users need, and either figuring out how to communicate what we do to them, in general, like how to solve whatever problems they're facing, and then internally, like what do we need to be building in order to meet those problems.
Is there any particular thing you like about your role, or maybe something you don't like? I mean, I'm assuming that it's kind of sometimes it's divided. A role has division into different tasks or in different experiences within that role. Is any particular areas within your role that you really like, and versus things that you don't care so much about?
I mean, don't care. What immediately comes to mind is back-to-back Zoom meetings. Not a fan. I'm pretty introverted, also not neurotypical. And so having to focus on like the Brady Bunch faces for hours on end isn't totally my jam. So that I could do without. But such is the COVID world, right?
Yeah.
What I do like is I'm constantly learning, both from my peers within the company as well as just kind of incidentally when we're developing things, for example, like looking into like serverless systems, understanding those better. I love leveraging the opportunity to kind of like flesh out my own knowledge base. Mm-hmm. So having that context switching as a kind of an excuse to satisfy my thirst for knowledge is really valuable. On the flip side, like aside from just Zoom meetings, context switching can also be draining to a certain extent. Yeah, I would say by far and away, the thing I enjoy the most is being able to learn all the time.
That's fantastic. And I think, as you mentioned, curiosity is one of the areas I think that is much needed. And I wish there's something we can teach. I don't know if we do that enough in school,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So if, you're obviously happy in your role right now, but if you had a choice in terms of doing your own thing, and it can be anything, what would that be? Would you still stay in security? Would you create your own, your own company? If you were independently wealthy, what do you do?
Part of me wants to say I would just build a cabin in the woods and just do a bunch of pontificating, lots of writing, both fiction and nonfiction, just researching whatever I wanted. I think I would get bored of that after a few months, probably. Even I have my limits on solitude and writing output. I think in general, am happy whenever I'm solving like really challenging problems. Like, again, when I'm learning a ton, I don't know if I would necessarily stay in information security or start to veer more and again into kind of like infrastructure technology, maybe loop back around to finance. I think depending on how wealthy you mean by independently wealthy, I'd love to kind of like have my own private equity firm and start buying security startups that I think are in need of some sort of makeover, kind of like one of like reality TV show style, but a little more intellectual than that. Just putting a fresh coat of paint on the different solution offerings of the company, whether again that's infrastructure technology or security, kind of like blending both what I've been able to develop as far as expertise in InfoSec with kind of the finance background. That would be a lot of fun.
So maybe like an intellectual version, cybersecurity focused Shark Tank, but less entertainment.
Like more that's more VC, I would say. Private equity is slightly different because not to go into like kind of finance lore and stuff like that. Private equity, it's a lot more of like taking kind of like a stale company versus venture capital where you're investing like a fresh company. But I like the challenge of taking something that may be a little too mature and a little out of date and overhauling it.
Fantastic. So, I tried to provide a glimpse of the folks behind the scenes, right? So I don't know if you can share like a personal win and maybe a personal loss for you in specifically for professional. I've seen a graph one time. Somebody mentioned that, especially for startups, how it looks like people think it's like a straight line, between the starting and the success. And then it was like, oh, okay, it's almost like a squiggly line between, so there's always ups and downs. Maybe you can share some of the experiences, some of the stories that you encountered through your career.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like it's definitely not been linear for me. That's for sure. I think the more recent win is later this autumn, I'll be publishing a book with O'Reilly on security chaos engineering. That's super exciting. I would say that's one of my bigger wins to date because writing a book was on my bucket list. So that's great. A ton of work, but it's been really fulfilling. And I'm hoping that it provides a lot of valuable information to the community. So that at least right now, that's kind of the biggest win on my mind. As far as losses, they're
Before
quite good.
we So before we jump into that, I would love to dig a little further, because you mentioned chaos engineering, and since you wrote a book, which is amazing. Again, I don't know, how do you find time between doing your day-to-day job and all the
I don't
rest
have
of
a
the stuff?
social life. Yeah.
And I always joke around that people, sorry, I just caught on to that.
Yeah.
People have like to-do lists, right? So they say, okay, write a book is a one-line item, as if like you can just go ahead and do that. It's pretty amazing. So chaos engineering has been around for a long time, so, and like the monkey wrench, whatever, Netflix has been doing that for a while, but and it never really actually took off, right? Because I don't know, maybe you can let's dive a little deeper into that specific space and see, why, first of all, why did you decide to write on that particular topic, and what are your observations, maybe like the net of it, of what the book is about.
Yeah, so I think chaos engineering has taken off more on the operations side. Obviously, there's still quite a ways to go, but I think more important than the actual, like, certainly the tools themselves or even some of the experiments, is more of the underlying philosophy behind it, which, as I am putting it in the book kind of as a joke, is like, if people are familiar with Fight Club, hopefully, but like the things you pwn will end up pwning you kind of thing. Like, you have to accept failure, right? Failure is absolutely an option, and it shouldn't be so scary. It's a learning opportunity if you can harness it correctly. And I feel like that philosophy has definitely permeated the general kind of zeitgeist, at least more on the infrastructure technology sort of side. Certainly not in security. I would say the security industry has this almost like paralyzing fear of failure. They want to avoid breaches at all costs, when really it should be about like, how can you minimize the impact and then recover more quickly. So a lot of what the book is about is kind of like the philosophy behind what security, or how security chaos engineering would look. It's not just the experiments, though I have quite a lot of those in the book as well, along with my co-author. A lot of it is just that kind of underlying philosophy, like how should you be thinking about building a security program? And it's also tailored towards people who aren't necessarily in InfoSec. There are people who are leading technology teams, both on like the dev or ops side, and how they can start incorporating more security thinking and security practices into their workflows in a way that actually works with their workflows. But again, that underpinning is really about resilience. It's about making sure that you're learning from failure, making sure that you accept that it's inevitable. Kind of, I think I've talked before about the stages of grief. Like, you're not just depressed about it. You're like, okay, it's going to happen, but I'm going to make sure that I'm well prepared, right? So I think that's really the beauty of chaos engineering. So even if people aren't using like the Netflix's like Chaos Monkey tools, or some of the tools that are talked about in our book, if you start embracing that philosophy, if you start thinking about experimentation and making sure that you're able to quickly uncover sources of failure, like, you're going to have a much better outcome regardless.
And I think the topic, could not be more, applicable to where we are right now, right? I mean, we look at where we are. Nobody thought we're going to all work remote, 4 or 5 months ago, right? I mean, that's a business continuity, but really, if that's not chaos, I don't know what is, right?
That's fair, yeah.
So we're and so what do you suggest to organizations that, as you mentioned, that are afraid of failure, and how do you test all those tools out there? I mean, enterprise have hundreds of tools in their disposal and running, and so how do you deploy these chaos engineering type of principles into an actuality to day-to-day operations?
Yeah, so that's a lot of what the book is about, is how to implement those. But to kind of like briefly summarize, a lot of it is don't focus on tools. I think people overlook people, but more importantly, they overlook process a lot. And that's especially true in information security. So a lot of what we talk about is, again, looking at, for example, like your security approval patterns. A lot of times there's a very kind of like gatekeeping vibe for any security reviews or security approvals before something's like deployed out there. But really, that's shooting yourself in the foot. Like, there's plenty of research, including by Dr. Forsgren with all of the Accelerate and State of DevOps research, that when you have slower releases and bigger releases with lots of like change approval gates, you actually have higher rates of failure in your releases. And that's certainly true in InfoSec. So it's little things like that, like understanding what the actual evidence in the market is showing, understanding that if you're able to be moving in like smaller batches and more nimble, that you can actually result in better security outcomes. So it's things like that that I feel like it's almost so basic that it seems obvious, or at least obvious in hindsight. But it really digs a lot into those process elements and how to design better security programs outside of whatever tooling you use. Again, like a lot of the book, you don't actually need to be necessarily conducting experiments in order to still improve your security program with a lot of these philosophical underpinnings. Obviously, experiments are really, really valuable. You really don't need that many tools for that either. If you want to start just like manually testing, that's not a bad way to start. If you want to start by trying out, like, can you get anonymous access to like your automation server? You don't need to automate that test at first, just see like what you can do. And trying out those like little experiments, I think will help people understand that it's not about buying a specific vendor or a specific tool. It's having that mindset of like, okay, let's just start hardening ourselves to failure. Let's make sure that when something does go wrong, we feel really prepared and we kind of understand the ins and outs of these systems in order to kind of like bounce back gracefully when some sort of incident does happen.
So it's almost like you're at a vendor, but you recommend then not to buy another tool.
Yeah,
You know?
I am all for anything to eliminate the number of security tools. The security industry is way too big relative to the risk it actually poses, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think we're going to see some consolidation in this industry, the next several years. So coming back to the original question, maybe we're about to talk about maybe some failures or things that did not go so well throughout your career. What would those be?
Tons of failures. I've been rejected from talks. I've been rejected from jobs. I've had rabbit holes. I have like a 60 item long list of just like research projects I have in my own spare time. Obviously, I don't have enough time for all of them. Some of them are rabbit holes that end up not going anywhere. So I feel like there's tons of time wasted. I think the main one, if I had to highlight it, which sounds super hokey and I would probably roll my eyes if I were listening to it, is the fact that I had a lot of self-doubt at first, coming from a background that wasn't as technical on the computer science side, and thinking that meant that I didn't have anything meaningful to contribute to the industry, which I think has, at least based on the feedback I've gotten, maybe everybody's lying to me to make me feel better. But it seems like what I have been able to contribute has been valuable, at least to some people in the industry. So I think I wish I had been a bit bolder about sharing kind of my voice sooner, and just putting kind of my thoughts out there, even though I know like sometimes my thoughts are somewhat half-baked and I'm kind of testing the waters to see how people respond. Because I really believe, iron sharpens iron. If I can get my thoughts out there and smart people kind of like attack and poke holes, that only means that my own thinking is going to get better. So I wish I had a little more courage to like put my own thinking out there sooner.
Yeah, I think it's very inspiring. I think we all have, self-doubts.
Absolutely.
I don't think there's anybody, that basically said, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm the greatest and so on. And having self-doubt, it's humbling, but it's also, part of the conquest is to overcome that and do it anyway. But obviously, it is no doubt that your contribution is tremendous. I mean, if you just have to, Google your name and see the amount of content you generate, it's pretty phenomenal. So we talked about the number of vendors. We talked about the security as a product. So if you had a crystal ball, right? What do you see happening in the next several years in the space? Are we going to end up in some sort of like cyber apocalypse, like everybody's saying, or are we, is the fact that COVID-19 hit and now we're like all working from home, and is attack surface is larger? Is that going to have an impact? What do you see? Like if you had a crystal ball and see what the trends that are going to be, prolific the next, 12 to 18 months, what would that be?
It's a good question. I definitely don't have a crystal ball. Let me think. I think there are two main things I'm seeing, and I think in some ways, putting aside obviously the massive tragedy that is COVID, one benefit specifically to the security industry is that it's challenged a lot of the existing assumptions for some security programs, that everything had to be on-prem, it had to be within this internal perimeter, you had to have the blinky box. Obviously, zero trust is like a huge buzzword, been discussed to death, but I think as security teams are now being kind of forced to migrate to like cloud infrastructure and cloud-based systems, they're realizing like, oh, maybe this isn't as scary as we thought. Like we thought it was going to be a huge loss of control, but actually it kind of makes our lives easier. I think that's a really positive trend. I think the other thing we're going to see, and this one I think there's going to be a lot more resistance, is again greater communication with the broader organization internally, but especially with like dev and ops teams. I think that's going to be absolutely essential because again, that's the new engine of business. Those are the people that are making the money. So anything standing in their way is probably going to be very heavily scrutinized and criticized. So if the security team can't speak the right language, can't successfully collaborate and communicate with those teams, I think that's going to be a problem. So I'm hoping we see more of a shift there and talk about stuff like that in the book as well. By the way, the initial report is going to be free. So I'm not just like advertising something you have to pay for. I would feel very bad about that. Yeah, so I at least hope to see in the next kind of like 36 months or so, more progress towards security opening itself up a bit, not being in a silo anymore, and really trying to think about how to communicate like security priorities to the rest of the business, and importantly, like listen to the rest of the business. I think InfoSec is terrible at listening to other disciplines and other kind of like IT factions, and it needs to listen. So that's what I'm at least hoping to see.
And do you think that the impact that COVID-19 had on the industry would that make change and accelerate some of the changes? Again, just everybody had to kind of work from home, and I think also the collaboration is now done differently between not just between DevOps and security, but in general throughout the organization. Most organizations are just kind of work remotely. So do you think that the changes are going to be long lasting, or people are going to come back to their own old ways afterwards?
I think it's going to be pretty difficult to migrate backwards. Like, how do you at this point, if you've migrated everything to at least like private cloud, how do you suddenly move back? I'm not sure if we're actually going to see that, particularly given cost savings and other benefits to the business. I think that's pretty unlikely. I think one thing that I've certainly seen at quite a few organizations is that this has really challenged the focus on tools and technology. Like I mentioned before, InfoSec has had tools and technology won't solve bad communication patterns, particularly when everyone's remote. You can't huddle in a room, particularly for things like incident response. So in a way, it's stress testing a lot of these processes. So I'm certainly hoping that this will be really big lesson learned for a lot of teams, that, okay, we actually have to think about like our playbooks. We have to think about how we operate under these kind of like stressful scenarios. So fingers crossed that it holds. I don't necessarily have a lot of faith. I'm generally a pessimist, but I certainly think a lot of the just fundamental kind of infrastructure shifts will probably stick.
Well, being pessimist, I think in this industry is pretty common, I think. But so there's a question here specifically around election security.
Oh, okay.
How can we help prevent the abuse? And by the way, this is something that came out today. One of my colleagues asked me about it, and it seems like it's started to float. Any way we can prevent something like this, or just to help mitigate?
I feel totally unqualified to answer that. I am not an election security expert. I know there are a lot of qualified people who have looked into it. I believe Matt Blaze is one of them, if I'm remembering correctly. So I don't want to talk out of my ass. So I'm going to decline to answer that, other than we should, I think we should not just be looking to like the security voting machines themselves, though those obviously terrify me, and a lot of the work into kind of validating the security of those is important. I think we also need to be looking to, like, as we've all heard, like the platforms that are kind of promulgating a lot of this abuse and making sure kind of like abusive information, and trying to ensure that we're handling those a little more gracefully. But again, definitely not an expert on that particular subject.
No, it's very, very humble response and very much appreciated. So what about privacy? A lot of the, COVID-19 now raises additional privacy concerns about potentially monitoring, location, temperature, and biological functions and so on. So any thoughts particular that what's your kind of approach to privacy?
Yeah, my general approach to privacy and thinking about it is if you don't absolutely have to collect the data, don't. That is obviously not something Silicon Valley follows at all. So clearly they're not listening to me, right? I think in general, it's thinking about privacy as a core use case for security, which I feel like doesn't always happen. Look at things like user entity behavioral analytics in most organizations. A lot of times they're looking at like what your browsing behavior is and trying to figure out like, are you going to be a rogue employee? That is incredibly invasive and incredibly violating of privacy. So I think it's very strange that security professionals would be keen to deploy those tools internally, even if it's to help insider threats, because I think we should be, in general, very aligned with kind of this privacy use case. Because ultimately, like I think most of us can agree that privacy enhances security and vice versa. I certainly don't buy the argument that you can't have security without privacy. And I would also argue, where is your evidence that you have to violate privacy in order to secure security? Because again, security in the grand scheme of things relative to other risks isn't necessarily that important. So my view in general is like the security team, when it's helping out, for example, with threat modeling, should be thinking about how data can potentially be abused, not just by attackers, but in general. Like what if there's an employee internally that, let's say, gets a little carried away with their imagination, does some stalking? Like the security team, I think, should be thinking about that. It's not just about attackers. It's also about like rogue developers, like accidental abuse, like purposeful abuse internally. Yeah, but you don't really see that a lot in security, and I wish you saw more of it.
Yeah, completely agree. And so the talk about chaos engineering. There's a question here is really interesting. It says, are any industry segments better positioned to practice control of chaos, and how does it impact compliance teams, if at all? Example given, even though working towards meeting new privacy protection legislation and so on.
Yeah, so I think compliance, it doesn't necessarily change a lot, though that's something I want to think about more maybe for the second part of the book next year. In theory, you could use some sort of experimentation to ensure that your like auditing controls and stuff are like functioning well. But I think in general, compliance, I would say, is not really necessarily affected by chaos engineering. The first part of the question, though, as far as which sectors are better poised, say any sector like, for instance, like e-commerce and retail that has really prioritized availability probably is going to have the right practices in place in order to really harness chaos for good, just because they're already going to be really caring about making sure they have as much uptime as possible. So they probably have like good infrastructure, they have better processes, they have good like incident response, all of which can really harness like the feedback loop you get from chaos engineering the best. I would say organizations that haven't had to care about things like uptime and availability, organizations that just can afford to be slow moving, let's say those that are in highly like regulated industries that tend to have more like oligopolistic or monopolistic competition, not really an incentive to have like super speedy software delivery practices. So I think they're going to struggle more.
And, this has been absolutely phenomenal. This is great. And, maybe we can give out a discount. Where can we find the book afterwards? I'm going to send that to the rest of the group as well. Where is it going to get published?
So it'll be through O'Reilly. I believe it will be on their website. I obviously don't have a link yet because it's a few months off out from now, but I'll also be publishing on like Twitter and LinkedIn, like a link to it. Again, it will be free. It will be a digital copy. I don't know if there's going to be an off wall or not. I personally hope not, but I don't know what they're going to do. But certainly I'll be talking about it literally everywhere once it's out.
That's great. And then people can find you on kellyshortridge.com, right? And
yes. Yep. Or swagit.com for my research site.
And then on Twitter, LinkedIn, people can definitely find you. What's the best way to reach you if someone wants to follow up and just say hi?
Yeah, so I will apologize in advance that I am terrible at that, just given the huge volume of emails I get. But emailing me is by far and away the best way to go. Bearing your message in a LinkedIn invite, I am very unlikely to see that. Twitter DMs, I never check. So email is definitely the best bet. If it is something urgent, please put like urgent in the subject line, just so I know. You can make sure to take a look out of the hundreds of others.
Kelly, I think I'm a testament for that. I think we had this planned for at least, I would like to say almost a year.
Yeah, something like that.
So, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Much appreciate, Kelly. It's been a real pleasure. It's amazing to see your contribution to the space. And hopefully you don't have any doubts anymore about that. And I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing you in flesh in New York City when things start to open up in one of our future events. And again, much appreciated on behalf of the New York Information Security Meetup and the Cyber Guild. I'd like to really appreciate and thank you for for taking part. Looking forward to seeing you in person, hopefully in near terms.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And hopefully everyone in the New York City area that's on this call, stay safe and healthy.
Perfect. Thank you all for joining. Much appreciated. Looking forward to seeing you in the next event. Thank you all.